Well, we're to judge all things. So how do you reconcile Jesus who says judge not, but Paul then says judge all things? Jesus is talking about hypocritical judgment as opposed to judging rightly by the standard of the word.
I really like your sermon today about how the fake analogy is putting in trust our minds. Fabulous.
Yeah.
Anyway, that doesn't change what you want to put in.
Okay. So, my wife will often start a sentence by saying, queso, and I go, cheese. Because queso is cheese in Spanish. Anyway. Anybody have queso? Like the hot stuff? Anyway, okay. So, how many of you remember the Judges cycle? I think it's important for us to review it.
They go into judgment, and things get really bad, they call out to God.
Yes.
And therefore they're judged. And come out of it. The judges finally die, and they go back into sin.
Yep.
They call out to God.
So we'll put this up on the board again real quick, just so we have.
Let that show while you put that up on the board, the Conley and Bosch.
Oh yeah. So yeah, good TV shows. Okay. There is some language in them, so I'm not saying you should watch them, but we do. Okay. So Bosch is actually it's B-O-S-C-H. Bosch is on Amazon. Okay. And it's Titus Welliver. I don't know if you know that name, but it's the guy who plays Bosch. And then it's the Lincoln Lawyer.
Lincoln Lawyer. Okay, thank you. Now we can get back to the we can judge those people underneath.
And they do make, in the books, they're brothers, but in the shows, there's no crossover. So, it is what it is. Because this is on Amazon and this is on Netflix. So,
the TV show I like to watch is In the Heat of the Night.
okay, yep. They also have a new Matlock out with Kathy Bates. Is playing Matlock, and I thought, oh no, they're just gonna, replace, try to redo the old show with Kathy Bates, and no, they've taken it a completely different direction. They borrowed the name Matlock, and they make a joke about it, and they say, oh, just like the TV show in the 90s, right? So they make a reference to the show, but it's a completely different thing, but they call it Matlock, so it's fun. Anyway, okay.
Well, in the Heat of the Night, they talk about Christianity.
Uh-huh.
And they use Bible verses, and it just it's like the main characters are godly and Christians. It's very special.
What is it on? What show?
No, it's a series.
Oh, okay.
And it's Monday through Friday from 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock. On channel. I'm not good with channels. Something like PBS, maybe. Like 27.1 or 27.2. Something like that.
Well, we're getting
Okay, so the Judges cycle always starts with Israel serving the Lord. Okay, so that's kind of the place where they always come back to. That's the place where generally it starts. Okay, so from Israel serving the Lord, we move down into Israel falls into sin and idolatry. Okay, the phrase that you'll hear a lot in Judges is, again, Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, that's the constant refrain we'll hear through this whole book. Israel is then judged, which usually involves some sort of oppression. But they're judged, and it's important to remember this, they're judged for their sin and for their idolatry. So they become oppressed. Okay? So so some will say, in some models you might see Israel is enslaved. It's kind of true. But Israel is judged. So, and the way of that judgment kind of takes a bunch of different forms. So like you'll have oppression from the Philistines, or you'll have oppression from the Philistines, or they'll come under some sort of servitude to like foreign kings where they have to pay tribute or something like that. And most of the time, these they're local judgments. They can be local judgments, or they can be national judgments. It really depends. The next step then is Israel cries out to God. Okay, so the weight of their judgment has proven to be too much, and so they cry out to God for deliverance. Okay, the next step then is God raises up a judge. Anybody remember what judge means? Judge is a deliverer. So in this sense, they're not, yes, eventually they do come into a leadership role where they're serving as a judge for Israel. But really what the judge does is the judge delivers. Okay? So God raises a judge. Israel is delivered. Okay, and that feeds back into Israel serves the Lord. And it's general but then it'll repeat this cycle all over again. And then usually what will happen is right here is where the judge dies. Okay? So they'll serve the Lord until the judge dies. And it's after the judge dies that they fall back into sin and idolatry. They'll fall. God will judge them. They'll cry out, and then they'll be going good until the judge dies, and they fall back into sin and idolatry. Okay, and it always gets a little worse every time they go through this cycle. Okay.
Test, failure, judgment.
Huh?
Test, failure, judgment.
Yeah, test, failure, judgment. Yep. So, yeah, but that'll be the cycle we watch as we read through. Some of these judges we have a lot of detail on because they serve as a judge for a long time. Some of these judges serve for a very short period of time, or what they deliver from is very short. They're very small oppression, but it's significant enough that they cry out. But their impact of their ministry is always bringing Israel back into right relationship. But then that doesn't last. Okay. So, we also talked about inflationary numbers, right?
Yes.
Okay, so who wants to try to describe for me what inflationary numbers are? Okay, that's financial inflation. I'm talking about literary inflation of numbers as a literary device. Yeah, Roger.
Increase the numbers to try to increase importance of what
Yes. Yes. Right. So if I say, for example, like who won the game yesterday? Oh, our team lost a gazillion to 1, right? I am inflating the numbers and deflating the numbers to describe how thoroughly we got trounced, right? If I say, for example, another way that I can do this, oh, my store made hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? I could be inflating the numbers to make it look good to the board, right? Not necessarily the best thing to do, but I'm giving inflationary numbers to give the appearance of success or to ascribe more honor. Or we could say something like Billy Graham has won millions to the Lord. Has Billy Graham really won millions to the Lord?
Probably.
Probably. I mean, that's probably good. But, we might say hundreds of millions. Then we're probably getting a little bit, but it's usually a hyperbole that we, or like, I think I shared this last time. My dad will say, this is the umpteenth time that I've told you, right? Or sometimes I'll say to my kids, I've told you this 7 times in the last 5 minutes, right? Has there really been 5 minutes? Did I really say it 7 times? No, what I'm trying to get across is my frustration, or I'm trying to inflate the numbers to try to highlight the importance of what it is that I'm saying. Trying to, like with that gazillion to 1, or if we can inflate the odds, right? Right? We might say, oh, that thing doesn't have it's 1 in a million, right? Is it really 1 in a million? I don't know, maybe. We like to inflate the numbers, and so what they do is, like we talked about last time, with this king of a city-state. What do we know about city-states? They're small. They tend not to have a huge domain, unless of course, you're talking about Grecian city-states, which are a whole another ball of wax. But they're usually, they rule a small portion. There can be a lot of them, but you generally don't have the manpower necessarily for a single city-state to conquer 70 other city-states, right? And so this king we saw last time, Adoni-Bezek, right, said, I have cut off the thumbs and the fingers, or the thumbs and the big toes of 70 kings. Was it really 70 kings? It could have been. Okay, that's a lot of manpower. That is a lot of resources. No, I think what he's saying there is they're inflating the number a little bit to ascribe more honor, more weight to the fact that they conquered this king. And this king is saying, I have been a great king. I have conquered my enemies completely and thoroughly. And I have done this to other kings to show the completeness of my conquest. And now I have been overthrown. Okay, and now what I have done to these other kings has been done to me. Okay? So inflationary numbers. And that'll become important as we go through. Because sometimes, like you look at the amount of people that a single man killed in this.
How do you know it's inflationary? I always took that as 70 as literal.
Okay.
70, yeah.
So they're inflationary. That's the way the Jews would ascribe more honor to something. We know that as a literary device. Okay? So we know that's a thing that they did. It's a thing we do.
Yeah, but I always took that number, that particular story is truly literal.
Okay, sometimes taking things wouldn't. So there's okay. So here's a good rule of thumb when we talk about a literal interpretation. Okay.
70 is 7, it's complete. That one particular phrase, I always took that particular phrase literal.
No. So like, does Jesus say 70? Right, 70 times 7. So Peter is inflating the number there because the law says 7 times. Right.
Right.
So he goes, okay, let me inflate the number just to show how holy I am. Let me inflate the number just to show.
490.
Right.
Perfect.
Right. So he says, okay, I'll just go 10 times more than what the law says.
Okay.
I'll go to 70. I'll inflate the number, right, to show how perfect I am in forgiveness. And Jesus goes, no, 70 times 7, which again shows it's inflationary. Okay. So yes, they can be literal numbers, and that is one way that we can handle that. But there's a difference between what is called wooden literalism, okay, and then what we would call a literal interpretation.
Or flexible.
So wooden literalism, when we're talking about that, we're taking it at face value, okay? And we're not budging on our interpretation. So for example, wooden literalism would say, when Jesus says, cut off your hand if it causes you to sin, gouge out your eye if it causes you to sin, right? We're taking that as being, that's what we should do, okay? That's what gets, I beat my body into submission, right? Wooden literalism is where you get when the Catholics will flagellate themselves, right? Some Catholic sects practice self-flagellation where they whip themselves because they're beating their body into submission. Okay, that's the kind of things wooden literalism can lead into. It's taking it literally. Okay? But there's another way in which you can take things literally. So in a literal interpretive method, we call this in our circles the historical grammatical method. And so what we do is we look at the history, we look at the culture, we look at the language, and that is how we arrive at our literal interpretation. So when we see hyperbole, we interpret that in light of the fact that it is literal hyperbole. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm following.
So as opposed to a wooden literalism, we take it literally in the way that it was meant to be taken. So if something clearly is hyperbole, we take it as hyperbole. If something is clearly an analogy, we take it as an analogy. And we interpret it literally in that way. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So when we look at, for example, we talked today about kairos versus chronos. That is a method by which we are looking at the literal interpretation of something. What does it actually mean? Not what the words say, devoid of context and history. Does that make sense? Okay.
Kairos, that's the order of when it's put in order when it's put.
Right. Right. But that is, so then if you take wooden literalism as it stands, Acts says he went to Cilicia first, and then he went to Syria, right? That's
Western thinking.
That's what Acts says. So if we're taking it wooden literally, if we're doing wooden literalism, then Paul creates a contradiction when he says, I went to Syria and Cilicia, right? So Paul is now lying because Luke establishes a different order of events. That's what wooden literalism gets you. You see what I'm saying? So if we go to the literal interpretation or the historical grammatical method, we understand how Paul will then use this ascribing more honor by putting this first because of its importance in his mind. Right? And thereby it doesn't create a contradiction because we understand how Paul as a Jew prioritizes kairos over chronos. Okay? So when we talk about inflationary numbers in the book of Judges, that's what we have to come to grips with. So when it says...
It's a problem for the ordinary lay person.
Yes.
The ordinary lay person doesn't know the history. They don't know grammar and things like that.
Yeah.
The ordinary person just has a Bible to read.
Yep. But that's part of being a good Berean. And I think we forget that. As part of being a good Berean is digging into the history. It's digging into the language. It's trying to peer back through time to understand what the original audience, how they would have understood it. And that requires a lot of work. And generally we as Christians get lazy. Okay? We don't like to do the groundwork. There was a big movement, especially in the early 1900s and stuff like that, where scholarship, intellectualism, was frowned on in the church. Okay? Where you didn't need scholarship because all scholarship is liberal and we just need the Bible. That's part of the problem with sola scriptura is that the Bible exists within a context. And we have to understand the context in which the Bible exists so we can accurately handle it. We don't do that with any other text. Right? When we look at the Iliad and the Odyssey, we understand that there's that ancient text that was written in a in a language, in a time period where we have to kind of understand the mythology and that kind of thing in order to interpret it right. We've discovered how there's rhyme and meter in the original Greek, and we've reconstructed how they would have sung it because we put in the work for that. But the second people start putting work into understanding the Bible, now we've got this thing called critical, liberal scholarship, and we kind of have an anti-intellectual bent. So we don't like to go into what the scholars say, because Sola Scriptura has told us that all we need to understand Scripture is in the Bible.
Anyway,
But we need to understand that the Bible itself has that background. So when we see somebody's killed hundreds of men with an ox goad, okay, did he really kill 700 men with an ox goad? Or is that inflationary numbers again? To ascribe honor and glory to what he did, as well as to ascribe glory and honor to what God did. Okay? So that's a literary device that they used, and we understand it that way. Okay? So let's take a look at verse 9, chapter 1. Later, so this is after they've attacked the city, after they've put it to the sword, after they've taken Adoni-Bezek, cut off his thumbs and his big toes. This is what happens next. Later, the men of Judah went down to attack the Canaanites living in the hill country, the Negev, and the foothills. The men of Judah attacked the Canaanites living in Hebron. Hebron used to be called Kiriath Arba. They killed Shishai, Ahaman, and Talmai. From there they attacked the people of Debir. Debir used to be called Kiriath Sefer. Caleb said to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sefer, I will give my daughter Aksa to be his wife. And when Othniel, the son of Kenza, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, Caleb gave him his daughter Aksha to be as a wife. So there you go. Let's kind of dig into what's happening here so we can understand the history. Okay, so the Negev. Okay, so the Negev refers to kind of the dry southern part of Palestine. So we're thinking, if we remember our map, and we remember where Judah gets their territory, and where Benjamin has gone with him. And remember what is important about Judah and Benjamin. They're using those names as stand-ins for the tribes, right? So it's not Judah, the person Judah, the patriarch, it's his tribe. And they talk about him by name and in the singular. So it's the tribe of Judah doing this. It's the tribe of Benjamin doing this. But they're referring to them as proper nouns, as people. Okay? So, here's our map. This is what? Okay, let's try this again. What is that?
a shield.
It's a harp. It's a harp. Okay? So that is what?
Damascus,
Nope.
Dan,
Think about where we are. This is Israel. This is
is it
Lake
water? Is that water?
Knesset.
Ah, water. You should have
What is
made it blue. That would help us know it's water.
what is Lake Knesset? What do we call that today?
Galilee.
Sea of Galilee. Okay, it's also called the Sea of Galilee. What else is it called in Scripture?
Capernaum?
Like what?
Tiberias?
There you go.
Well, that depends if you're, what is our
So Lake Knesset is what they call it today. It's even called that. I believe it's called that in the Scriptures. Knesset just means harp. So harp lake. We call it the Sea of Galilee, but also in the Bible they called it they called it Lake Tiberias, because on this part of the lake is the city Tiberias. okay, which was a city built in honor of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, okay? Then we have this thing that kind of flows down. What's that? Jordan. Or, in Scripture, the Yarden, right? But yeah, the Jordan. Okay, and then it ends in what?
Dead Sea.
The Dead Sea. Some conjecture will say that the Dead Sea is actually the region in which Sodom and Gomorrah existed.
Makes sense.
Okay, so there's
So full of salt.
salt.
So an earthquake could dump the salt over onto people.
Yeah. Well, it might not have been. It might not have been like that before the judgment.
Yeah, the salt right
Yeah.
down from heaven. So that's
Yeah.
where all the
Oh, okay.
Salt and sulfur and yeah. Okay, so Judah basically gets this whole chunk because guess what's right here? Ish.
Mountains.
Nope. What's so this whole section, other than this one little place in here, is Judah.
I don't know. Maybe we're playing picture.
You're thinking too hard. It's a city. What city is right there in Judah?
Jerusalem.
There you go. I promise I'm not asking trick questions. So remember, they're pushing south. So the Negev is in this section, kind of by where this dip happens, going into the Sinai Peninsula. It's a dry, arid land. Okay. I promise you'll have this map down at some point. All right. There are lowlands. The lowlands are a geographical area, which is from the hill. Okay. So, this is a body of water out here. Anybody know what that body of water is called? What? That's the Mediterranean. The Med. Okay. So from the Mediterranean inland is the lowlands. So it starts here and it kind of runs this way. Okay. So the Negev is this section, the lowlands is this section. So Judah and Benjamin are pushing south. Okay. Also, you can now answer more questions than the people who chant from the river to the sea, because they couldn't answer which river and which sea. So from the river to the sea, right? Now you know which river and which sea. Okay. So the Mediterranean, so the lowlands ran from the Mediterranean Sea to the hill country of Palestine. It is also called Shephelah, okay, which we'll show in the topographical map once we get that pinned up. Hebron is Caleb has sent. Caleb has already conquered Hebron, but there's a brief retelling of this conquest in Judges that we're reading here, 1 through 20, Judges 1, 1 through 2:5. So we're kind of getting a retelling of this. So what's happening is, as they're conquering down, Judah is helping Benjamin take their territory. Because Benjamin has this kind of like weird hole carved out in the middle of Judah. Eventually, what's going to happen to Benjamin is Benjamin's kind of going to lose its tribal identity and become part of Judah. Okay? But Paul is still going to be able to say, I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. So it's not like the tribe of Benjamin completely disappears, but they kind of lose themselves in Judah a little bit. Okay? So this is just the story of the conquest that is happening, that is kind of going to be setting the stage for our next little bit. Kiriath Arba was ruled over by the father of Anak. The number 4 refers to the confederated city-states. It's also the name of, huh?
Is Anak a giant?
Yeah, we'll talk about him in a bit. That was in Joshua. But yes, he was a big guy. The number 4 refers to the confederated city-states, and it's also the name of a Babylonian deity. So there's some plays on words here where we're not only talking about conquering cities, but we're talking about conquering deities. Okay? Because the thing we have to understand about these religions in this time period is warfare was always a contest between gods. Okay, if my God is more powerful than your God, my army is going to be victorious over your army, right? That proves which God is stronger, which God we should worship. And these gods are always regional. So when he's talking about here in Kiriath Arba, he's talking about a Babylonian deity, but this was also the name of the city-state. So it's not only the locality, but it's also the God who rules the locality, okay? Picking up in verse 14. One time Aksa came and charmed her father so she could ask him for some land. When she got down from her donkey, Caleb said to her, "What would you like?" She answered, "Please give me a special present. Since you have given me the land in Negev, now give me the springs of water." So Caleb gave her both the upper and lower springs. Okay, so he's giving her a wedding present. There you go. Now the descendants of Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of date palm trees to Arad into the wilderness of Judah, located in the Negev. There they lived with the people of Judah. So Moses' father-in-law's people are living in Judah with the rest of them.
Okay, I'm a little bit lost. Wilderness of Judah, south of Arab is where it says mine. So Negev and Arab are one and the same.
Arad.
Arad.
Okay, so we'll get into that here in a second. Okay, so Caleb, ironically, anybody know what his name means?
No.
Caleb means dog.
Dog?
Dog, like wolf, wolf. Yeah.
Oh, good.
He was brother of the judge Othniel. He was not an Israelite, which is interesting to note. He was a Kenizzite. So he was part of Moses' father-in-law's family. Okay? So remember, when Moses leaves Egypt, where does he go? He goes into the wilderness. He goes and marries Zipporah, right? It's her name. And Zipporah is not a Jew. She's a Kenite. And so when Moses goes to leads the people out of the Exodus, he takes his father-in-law's family with him. It's a whole tribe. And so they reside now with Judah. Okay? So Caleb is not part of the 12 tribes. He's a Kenizzite. Does that make sense? So you have a Jew in Joshua, and you have a Kenizzite in Caleb who come back and say, "We can take the land." Right? It's kind of an interesting thing there. But they were incorporated into the clan of Judah. So they were given a clan identity, even though they were Kenizzites and not of the Jewish people. They were given,
Name your son Dog.
I don't know, maybe it came out looking like a dog. I don't know. So when we talk about in the ancient Near Eastern culture, there's the bride price, right?
Maybe it's a cute puppy dog.
Maybe he looked like a puppy, yeah.
Dogs, they will treat dogs by, they call
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Well, remember, he's not a Jew, so yeah, there's maybe not that negative connotation there about a dog. So at this time in the ancient Near East, the price of a bride may not have been in valuables, okay? So she's getting her dowry from her father. And that's why she's asking for the springs. The springs of water are located in the Negev, okay? And she's given this lot of land for her and Othniel to live on. And it incorporates 2 springs. Now, springs are a big deal in the Negev because they're a source of water in the desert. Okay? So she's giving her a lot of wealth. Okay? Because wealth in that day and age is not just measured in coinage, it's measured in possession. Okay? So Moses' father-in-law tribes, he goes by several names, Moses' father-in-law does. He goes by Hobab, which we find in Numbers 10, 29, and in Judges 4:11. He goes by the name Ruel, which we find in Exodus 2:18. And he goes by the priest of Midian, which again we find in Exodus 2:16 and 3:1. But the name we commonly know him by is what? Anybody remember? If I said Leroy Gibbs, what is Gibbs' middle name? Anybody remember? Leroy Jethro Gibbs. Jethro, okay?
So he has a different religion.
Not necessarily. You can be a worshiper of the one true God without being a worshiper, without being a Jew. Okay, so he's a priest, and we'll see how that all plays out here in a bit. However, in Numbers 10:29, he is called Hobab, the son of Ruel the Midianite. Names are often repeated within families. Okay, so this happens in our families too. There are family names, and it can kind of make the family tree a bit of a mess when you're trying to fill it out, right? So this is the same thing. Names are often repeated within families, so this makes it hard to document individuals with only a list of their parents or their locality. Okay, so sometimes you might be Brian of Jerusalem or Brian of Nazareth, okay? But you also might be Yeshua ben Yosef of Nazareth, okay? So now you're getting more specific. So that would have been Jesus' name, Yeshua ben Yosef, okay? Ben means son of, right? The city of palms. Anybody remember what the city of palms is? What? Anybody want to take a stab at what city do you think that is? The city of palms is Jericho, okay? So the city of palms was an early name for Jericho, but in this context, it possibly refers to a city in South Arad, which could have been Tamar, but it's commonly it's more often than not is Jericho. It was utterly destroyed, which denotes a special kind of warfare, which they would have called the ban. Right? So in Joshua, things are put under the ban. If a city is put under the ban, it's dedicated to destruction. Everything has to be destroyed. Okay? We see this as a problem later for the kings, especially for Saul, because Samuel comes up and the city has been dedicated to the ban, which means it's been dedicated to God for utter destruction. That's generally that utter destruction is the judgment that God has levied against the city for their wickedness. Okay, Saul doesn't destroy the city utterly. In fact, he keeps the animals. And so when Samuel gets there, he finds out that Saul has made the sacrifice. When it's only Samuel has that right. And then he says, "What is this bleating of sheep that I hear?" Right? So that's why Saul loses his kingdom. Okay? So that's a problem. So when it's dedicated to the ban, that's what this means. Is this city of palms was utterly destroyed under the ban earlier in time. So this would have been under Joshua. Everything living in the city must die, animals and humans. No spoils of war must be taken. The city was dedicated to God and became too holy for humans to use. Okay? So nobody was to live there anymore because now it was holy ground. All right? So are we...
How do you explain that to the non-believers?
Like I just did. So the ban, killing everything living, first of all, it's God's prerogative to do that, right? Because he's a holy and just God.
I agree because I'm a believer, but
Right. So the ban, here's the thing. If they're not going to believe if they're not going to believe. And you can give them the explanation. They just might not like the explanation. So the ban is judgment. Okay? So God has the city that's been put under the ban, has been so evil, has been so wicked that God has said, I have had enough. because of this, you are now under divine judgment, and everything living in this city is going to be destroyed because of how wicked you have been. So God is using Israel as a means of dispensing divine justice. Okay? Divine justice doesn't always look pretty. Okay? So, I mean, think about Sodom and Gomorrah. Think about Jericho. Think about the flood. Divine judgment always doesn't look pretty. Okay? It's not a happy thing. Okay? Especially for those on the receiving end. It's not a happy thing. So the reason God institutes the ban is because he's using Israel as a means of judgment against these nations. But he's also showing something to Israel. He's showing to Israel the cost of sin. Here's what's going to happen to you if you go after foreign gods. These gods are so wicked. Many of them demanded child sacrifice. Many of them were fertility sex cults, things like that. So he's not only showing his divine judgment against these wicked nations, but he's also showing Israel what the cost is going to be if they don't, or if they go after foreign gods. So he's showing them the seriousness of the sin. Yeah.
Well, from what I remember, those fertility gods at the center of the study of the ancient cultures, they all had sexual diseases and things like that was rampant in this cultures, those things.
Could be, yeah. It probably would have looked a lot different than what we have today, but yeah. So that's what the ban is for. The ban is two sides of a coin. So you've got the judgment on the one side, and you've got Israel being shown what's going to happen to them if they go after false gods on the other side.
Which makes us think that, the United States isn't that far away.
Yeah, but this is Old Testament, so this is not something that
That's true.
is in effect today. But that's what the ban was.
Nothing is new under the sun.
Nothing is new under the right. So, but this was specifically for Israel at that time, and it was something they were called to do in conquering the nations. They were to utterly destroy. Sometimes when they destroy a city, they are allowed to keep the stuff. But it really depends on if God said the city was under the ban or not. If it's under the ban, it's totally devoted to destruction. Everything in it dies. Okay? Yeah.
Do you think that because of the ban, because of the judgment, Israel didn't always fulfill that? In other words, they didn't want judgment on themselves, so they didn't judge the city or people?
There are times when they don't. So like I'm telling you, like Saul goes up against the city that's under the ban, and he leaves the livestock alive, right? So that's why Samuel, when he comes up, he says, "What is this bleating of sheep that I hear?" Meaning everything hasn't been dedicated to destruction. And then Saul tries to laugh it off a little bit. But yeah, the ban was, again, to show Israel how serious God is about not adopting the gods of other places, not to fall into idolatry. Because that's Israel's whole problem, is idolatry. I mean, even when Moses is up on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments from the finger of God, he comes back down and Joshua says to him, "There's a sound in the camp." And as they go back down, they see them worshiping a cow, right? And so Moses takes the very tablets inscribed by the finger of God, smashes them on the ground. And God's like, "All right, I'll start over with you, and we'll make a holy nation out of you, and we'll kill all of them." And then what does Moses do? He's like, "Don't kill them." He intercedes on their behalf. But they always struggle with idolatry. And we see this from the moment at the bottom of the mountain, Mount Sinai. We see this all the way through the book of Judges. We'll see this all the way through Kings, all the way through Chronicles. all the way through the New Testament, even they've made an idol out of the law. They just struggle with idolatry because they didn't learn the lesson of the ban. Okay? All right, so we'll pick up more next week. Nope, next weekend's the soup thing, so we'll pick up 2 weeks after that. Yep.
Oh, it's next week?
The soup thing.
Soup thing?
Is it next week or 2 weeks?
I think it's next week. Let me